Everyone, it's 1:30, so we'll get started. This is Improving Documentation with Beginner's Mind by Karen Rustad. This is a 30-minute talk, including 5 minutes Q&A at the end. Let's welcome Karen Rustad.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen, and I'm a grad student at UC Berkeley. I'm also on the board of OpenHatch, which is a nonprofit about doing outreach and making open source projects friendlier to newcomers. And so giving a talk on how to write beginner-friendly docs. So at last year's PyCon, Jacob Kaplan-Moss gave a lovely talk on writing good documentation that I am going to steal from here. In his talk, he had a slide about the 6 audiences and purposes that documentation serves. So we have documentation for first contact, which is trying to answer the question, what is this thing and why do I care? Education, how do I better use this thing? Support, why it's answering the question, why doesn't my thing work? Troubleshooting, pretty similar. Why doesn't my frickin' thing work? Internals, so for contributors, how do I get involved in this project? How do I add on to it? And then finally, reference documentation, which is answering questions like, how does that thing work again? The kind of stuff that no one remembers. So of these 6, my talk today is going to be focusing on the first thing, just for context, specifically documentation targeted at new users. So when you're writing documentation, there's really 2 areas of documentation that are the most important. First, your installation and setup instructions, and your tutorials. And the reason for that is if these are bad, newcomers are going to be discouraged, they'll not know what to do, and they'll just never even see the rest of your documentation. So that makes these extra important just because otherwise the rest of your stuff just doesn't count. Yeah, so what makes a good tutorial good? Well, there's 4 factors. First, what a good tutorial advertises what about the project is cool or unique, or how it relates within an ecosystem to other similar libraries. What does this thing do that nobody else does? Second, a good tutorial is enjoyable. It should be fun to read. It shouldn't be too long. It doesn't have to be super entertaining, but it should get to its point. But people should still enjoy going through it. 3, the tutorial steps should have a high likelihood of success. So that means being platform agnostic as far as possible. It means including all the steps, not leaving gaps where people might not know what to do. It means testing the code and command snippets to make sure they're still up to date and haven't become defunct with the latest version of the software. Things like that. Because you want to make sure that when people go through the thing and follow the instructions you've given them, they're going to make it to the end. And finally, a good tutorial is preparing the reader not just to do the tutorial, but for using this project, this library, whatever it is, for their own projects. And so these goals can conflict. What makes something great advertising for a project is not the same thing necessarily as something that prepares someone to actually build something with it. And concerns about length and concerns about readability, all of these things sort of interplay with one another. Going back to the 4th factor that I like to note is one thing to note about how newcomers use tutorials, and you probably know this from your own use of them, is that, yeah, the first time you go through the tutorial, you actually follow the tutorial's instructions and build whatever sample application or sample what have you that the tutorial builds. But then what you do is you go back and you follow the steps of the tutorial to build your first project. So newcomers use tutorials as scaffolds for whatever it is they came to your project in the first place to work on. And so being aware of that when you're writing your tutorial, making sure that it's not just something that works these steps in order, but actually is a good example for how newcomers are going to start their projects is an important thing to keep in mind. So for the rest of this, I'm taking the Django tutorial as a case study for the rest of this, for a number of reasons. Why use Django? It has good docs. It has a reputation for having good docs. Jacob gave the documentation last year, of course, and knows everything about this. And also, Django is the project that I use the most in my free software work, so I'm pretty familiar with it. And so I've created two personas, two people, fictional people, who are going through the Django tutorial, trying to use it to get kickstarted on their own projects, to learn how to use Django for their own stuff. So person number one is a person named Kira. She's a CS undergrad. She already knows Python and a bunch of libraries with it, pretty experienced with it, but hasn't done web dev before and has some sort of web app that she wants to build. Persona number two is Kevin, who is primarily a designer, has done some intro Python tutorials, knows the basics, and wants to get up to speed for working with Django in his new job, and just is generally curious about learning more about web development. So what we're going to do next is go through the Django tutorial step by step, just do a run through, and point out all the places where our two fictional users might get stuck or misled or confused, and otherwise not know what to do next. So it's worth noting here that some of the issues I'm going to point out have actually been fixed. There have been some updates to the Django tutorial, which is great. So I'll just pretend those aren't there for the purposes of learning. Yeah, so some of these issues aren't there anymore. Some still are. That's fine. Anyway, so the beginning of the Django tutorial, here's what it looks like on the website. But there's really a step 0 before this. Installation, obviously, comes first. You can't do the tutorial if you don't have Django on your machine. And that's where we run into our first bit of a hiccup, installation hygiene. All of the installation instructions on Django's website have you install the package site-wide. Now, why is that bad? Well, if you've done development with Django or other things where you've got multiple projects going at once, and so maybe one website is still using Django 1.2, another's using 1.4, maybe you've got the development version for some reason, for some other thing, you want to be able to isolate those from each other, otherwise you're not going to be able to run them all together on your machine, at least in any clean, easy way. And so using things like pip and virtual env to isolate these things from each other, or using another mechanism for doing that, is really important. But if you're a beginner, you're not going to know about any of those resources. You're not going to know that this is a best practice to isolate different development environments from one another. And the Django website isn't going to tell you to do that. Yeah, so continuing. Starts the tutorial, and the first thing we do is create a Django project called MySite. And we sync the database, we discover the development server, that's pretty cool. Somewhere along these lines, hopefully we'll be able to run through the tutorial cleanly, but sooner or later we're going to run into a bug that just reading the code isn't going to be obvious on how to fix it. And if you're a newcomer, you may not know about some of the resources there are for debugging, either in general or for Django specific. So Kevin probably doesn't know about PDB yet. Definitely doesn't know about the Django debug toolbar, which if you aren't already familiar with that, will save your life and sanity. And not having access to those resources, if he runs into a problem, it's going to be really hard for him to figure out what to do next. Kira, similarly, also doesn't know where to get help from a human. When she runs into a problem, or even just like a conceptual issue, who can she ask for help? And so knowing about things like the Django IRC channel or the Django users mailing list, and having a really prominent link on the tutorial documentation to those resources is super important. So we create our first Django app, polls. And so here, one thing that for a long time the tutorial didn't really explain was the distinction between a project and an app within Django. And so it was easy to assume that you should just put all your code inside this app and that the distinction didn't really matter. That's not what you're supposed to do. what you're supposed to do is have each subset of functionality, each app should reflect one function of your website, and then they work together. That results in cleaner code. It makes it easier to pop things in and out, makes things more modular. But you're not going to learn that from the tutorial. And so you see a lot of beginning Django sites that just cram all their code into one place and have it really messy and impossible to disentangle, just because they don't know this from the beginning. Also with apps, the idea of code reuse, the fact that there's a Django package index that if you're trying to build something in Django, it probably already exists in some form or another there. That can be really useful. Now, for newcomers, newcomers love to reinvent the wheel. That's what they'll default to do because they don't know what is out there. And sometimes that's okay. Writing your own blog or writing your own wiki or all these other pieces of software that have already been written, doing it yourself is a learning experience. And there's nothing wrong with that. But doing it just because you don't know what's out there, writing the user class yourself, writing comments yourself, instead of being aware that you can use code that other people have written and is better than yours will be and has been tested, that's something people should know. Yeah. After we've created our Django app, we then have a list of files that the app generator created. So there's an init, of course, models.py, views.py, etc. And then there's this other thing, test.py. And it's just kind of listed there, and then the tutorial keeps going and never discusses what this file is for. And so if you've already heard the gospel of test-driven development, you can guess what test.py is for. Okay, that's where you put your unit tests and whatnot. So you can do test-driven development. But if you aren't already familiar with that concept, you're probably just going to gloss over it, just like the tutorial did, never even open it, and then you won't have tests. Which is really tragic for a tutorial, because having tests is a great learning tool. Having tutorials where you provide them with a test file to begin with, and then as they go through the tutorial, more and more tests pass, is a great way to have people see their progress as they go, and also teach them these best practices with testing first. Keeping going. So yes, we create our models. We have our poll model and our choice model in the tutorial. And we add the application in our settings, and we sync the database again. And sooner or later, we're going to hit the biggest gotcha that I'm probably going to present, which is schema migrations. No one gets their models right the first time, especially as a beginner. You're always going to be editing them and tweaking them and changing the options on the various fields. And eventually, you're going to hit something that just running syncdb is not going to work. And the really tragic thing about this is that when you hit that point, when you hit that point, you can't just then magically discover South somehow and have migrations and be happy again, because you're going to have to revert whatever changes broke everything, or start over in order to have South track your application. So the fact that migrations aren't even mentioned in the tutorial, that's probably the biggest thing that newcomers run into when actually trying to build their own Django application, is that suddenly they can't edit their models anymore, and they don't know why. If they haven't worked with databases before, if they haven't worked with SQL before, or migrations before, this is all going to be completely new and unexpected. Page 2 is all about the admin, that there's an admin app, and that's kind of cool, and also customizing the admin app in various ways, which, if you're building a newspaper application, is pretty useful. If you're not, it's really not. And the amount of coverage that the admin gets just seems like kind of like an interruption within the tutorial. You write your URLs and your views. You write your first templates. And through all of this, it's all been, we've got this admin backend that you can edit stuff on, and then you've got a URL that if you ping the URL, that's a vote. But there's no real user-facing CRUD, which stands for create, read, update, and delete operations. And someone like Kevin, who does user experience design, that's his bread and butter. That's what he expects a web app to be, is something user-facing, where you have things like comments and user-generated content. You have things like Ajax, all these things that work. And right now the tutorial isn't telling him how to do it, which makes it easy to assume that this just doesn't exist or is really hard. In the new version, instead of voting via URL, we have a form, which is okay, except for Django has a built-in forms object that does lots of useful things for you, like cleaning data and stuff like that. The tutorial doesn't use its own built-in for handling the form. And that seems a little bit of an oversight. And if you happen to find out about forms and model forms specifically, the documentation there doesn't tell you how to style the forms, things like making the form appear within paragraphs versus in a table versus in a list. And that makes them really hard to style. I didn't even know about a lot of these features until the deep dive on forms yesterday that Nathan gave. And I've been working with Django for years. So newcomers definitely aren't going to just discover this. Yeah, and then Ajax, again, also not part of the tutorial. And then finally, at the end, there's a bit of coverage of generic views. That's kind of cool. And we're at the end of the tutorial. But there's so many more things that a basic web application is probably going to care about. Oh, and then there's this what's next link now, which is great and awesome, but didn't used to be there. Anyway, so one thing we might care about when building a basic Django application is static and media files, having a CSS style sheet so you can make your web app pretty, having images of any sort, either uploaded or ones that are just part of the website. And that's not explained in the tutorial at all. And the distinction between static and media can be kind of confusing. So it's a little bit of a shame that that's not explicitly covered there. Template inheritance. All the templates in the tutorial are just standalone templates, copy and paste. That's not so great. What you want to do is have things inherit so that you're not copying and pasting your header over and over again, and every time you change something, having a giant headache. And Kevin, as a designer, probably knows well enough that that ought to exist. Yeah. And then finally, showing off, having deployment options that are easier than setting up Apache and setting up this whiskey nonsense that you may or may not have worked with before. If you've never done web app development of any sort, you're definitely never going to have seen this stuff before. Being aware of things like platform as a service stuff that support Django, like Heroku and Django Zoom and stuff like that, so that you can easily show off, hey, I made this really stupid cool web app for the first time, let me show my friends, is one of the more rewarding aspects of learning to program, and that's something that you want to make easy. Yeah, so it's worth asking the question here at this point that most of the issues here aren't strictly Django. They're more best practices or other things in sort of the web app ecosystem. So why should the Django tutorial care about them? Why is it its responsibility to teach? And it's a worthwhile question. What is the purpose of this tutorial? Going back to the previous slide, we've got these 4 goals. If our emphasis is mostly on goal number 1, like advertising what makes this project awesome, then our target audience is probably fairly experienced web programmers, already know best practices, and they can compare with other frameworks, and so they don't need as much background. Whereas if we emphasize number 4, then our target audience are newcomers to web programming who we can indoctrinate into the cult of Django. So the question is your goal to build a community or just to build another library? And either answer is just fine. But if you do want your project to take over the world, you need to take the long view and expect more from your tutorials and other intro docs than you otherwise would. Comprehensive tutorials are possible. The RailsBridge tutorial, which is ostensibly a tutorial to learn Ruby on Rails, covers all of this other stuff as well. The PyStar version of the Django tutorial similarly took its cues from RailsBridge and also covers all sorts of things from Git to CRUD to deployment. This is a version of the Django tutorial I put together for an intro web programming class that I taught last semester that covered a lot of the similar stuff as well, including things like Ajax, since the students in the class were more familiar with JavaScript and front-end development. Yeah, so a disadvantage of this approach with comprehensive tutorials is that they are longer, it takes more work to write them, but you can mitigate that somewhat by making your tutorials have a modular structure instead of just being one queue beginning to end, which Ruby on Rails guides does pretty well. And also, even just having links to other people's stuff is a huge step, even a link to a Google search, because newcomers don't know the lingo. They don't know what to search for. And blind searching is only going to get you so far. So introduce as much as you can, even if you can't go into depth about it. So do we want to write a tutorial that's intro to Django, or do we want to write intro to web programming using Django? Why not have both? Documentation needs to serve multiple masters, as Jacob said last year. That's the whole point. And so the same material has to appear in places in multiple ways to serve those different audiences, and that's fine. So some strategies, common issues in intro docs writing, assuming familiarity with Bash is a big one, assumptions about the platform, just having a list of directions without saying why isn't very good for teaching, code samples that no longer work because the software's been updated since the tutorial was written, and finally not having an obvious place to ask for help. Look for those, they're mighty common. And then strategies for writing better docs. Just remember, we were all newcomers once. And just as the strength of a rationalist is to notice that you are confused, the strength of a good docs writer and community manager is to notice your own expertise and how your experience makes it easier to be working on a given project, and compensate accordingly when you're writing. If you don't remember what it was like to be a newcomer, find a newcomer and have them go through the tutorial in front of you. Go to your local Python user group or other user group and watch and see people try to get involved with your stuff. And take notes when they get stuck. Include your docs in your test framework. If you're using Sphinx, it's pretty simple to have your test runner also run over the code inside your documentation. And so your code samples, it'll tell you if they no longer work. Say who you're writing for at the beginning. Is this tutorial meant for absolute beginners who are just barely know Python? Or is it targeted at a more experienced group of people who know more things? Making your dependencies explicit is important, not just for software, but also for human beings. And almost finally, having different tutorials for different audiences, it's definitely key. A tutorial that is Django for Zope refugees is going to look very different than that. Welcome to the pony cult. And so these should be different documents in your documentation base. And yeah, all of these are hard. It's a lot of work. That's true. But if you can't just do it yourself, file a bug, and hopefully someone else will also take care of this burden for you. Yeah. That's what I got. And on to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
So we have 5 minutes for Q&A. If anyone has a question, please use this microphone or that one.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I was just curious if you have any data on how often someone has installed a package and then site-wide and then needed different versions of it for different projects and like run into that problem where they actually needed a virtual env?
I don't have any data without like installing some keyloggers on an awful lot of newcomers' computers. I can say that I haven't worked on a project that didn't end up like. I'm most familiar with virtual env because every project I've been involved with has advised that for how to keep these dependencies straight. There are probably other systems that other people use to keep things straight, like maybe people even use whole virtual VMs to run this stuff. But I would be surprised that you would do this for more than a few years and not have some things in the latest version of Django and other things still in whatever version of Django they started with when the project began. Like, that's kind of how these things tend to run.
So I'm glad you got to multiple versions of tutorials for different audiences, because definitely during the first portion of the talk, I was thinking about like, well, if she had already taken the database class, then she wouldn't have had that question. But that leaves me thinking where to start with. Mm-hmm. And so for me, as primarily a developer, because I don't have the goatee, I would think, well, I'll start with the, assuming that they're going to be already familiar with the rest of the environment, mm-hmm. and maybe write about stuff that's really specific to my project, and maybe that can be like a modular kernel that somebody else can refer to.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine and great. I mean, it goes the other way too. You wouldn't want to send a bunch of people who have been doing web development for 10 years and makes them sit through something that teaches them everything from, soup to nuts. Like, of course, that's not being nice to your users either. Saying at the top of documentation, be like, we assume that you're familiar with X, Y, and Z. Like, this is generally what we're expecting. And then starting the tutorial is probably the best way to make that explicit. Because otherwise, people just don't know.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Karen, thanks for this talk. This is partly sort of a plug for something I care about, but I'll try and phrase it as a question.
Great.
What thoughts do you have about useful balance between descriptive text, code samples, and diagrams, which seem to be in pretty low supply?
I like them all. I would definitely agree with you on the diagrams. I mean, I'm definitely a visual learner, and so having, people have been trying to draw in Django the MVC, like separation, and what does that look like in Django, and which part is which, and people disagree about this passionately, which is probably part of why there is no diagram in the Django tutorial. Yeah, I definitely advocate having those. I can understand why they're a little bit more work to create, especially if the person writing isn't also someone who does graphical things. But yeah, that's definitely a good thing to remind people of.
Hello, my name's Lynn Root, and I'm actually trying to start up PyLadies San Francisco, so if you have a question, find me. But I am leading a workshop in Python. We're just getting into Django, and I had just learned Django maybe a few months ago, made my own website. And I went through the whole process, and I was like, all right, I understand step by step what I need to do, but what the hell am I doing? So it's like a forest and a trees sort of thing. So do you have advice for writing tutorials on how to see like the forest as well as the trees?
Diagrams. Yeah, that's definitely one step. Having a modular focus that you've like the kernel of everyone needs to know this in Django to start, and then people making their path into the forest from there is one nice thing to do. Beyond that, though, like the unspoken part of this is that written explicit docs will only get you so far. Having at least one other human you can ask stupid questions of will make a life and death difference with getting involved in a new project or using a new library that you don't know anything about yet. So yeah, like starting a meetup and getting a bunch of other Django learners or people of different ability levels, like that's also definitely something to point to. Thank you. Yeah.
Last question.
Okay.
So I noticed that you had created sort of user personas for the documentation, which is, I guess, the point. How in depth do you like to go with those personas, like right down to the goatee, or what?
I mean, the goatee is not essential. The goatee does not indicate progress. I mean, I like drawing pictures of the people that I'm sort of envisioning using stuff. My background is originally as a designer, so I sort of come from that perspective, and because I can draw, I do. Right. But that's obviously not necessary at all. You do not need to draw pictures, or you can have like little stick figures and still do this stuff well and still have sort of empathy for what people are going to go through.
Do you always name your personas?
That's a bad habit, yes.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.